Hi, I'm Sophia Martinez. I was 17 years old, valedictorian of my class at Jefferson High, with a full scholarship to Stanford waiting for me. I had my whole life planned out, pre-med, then medical school, maybe pediatrics. My parents were so proud. Our little doctor, they'd call me at church functions, beaming as neighbors congratulated them on raising such a successful daughter. But one October night, everything changed when my father screamed those words that still echo in my head 15 years later. "What have you done?" It was a Tuesday. I remember because Tuesdays were family dinner nights. Mom's famous pot roast, Dad's stories from his accounting firm, my younger brother Jake complaining about soccer practice, and my sister Emma showing off her latest art project. We were the picture-perfect American family, religious, respectable, involved in every church committee and community event. I was rushing to set the table when my backpack slipped off my shoulder, spilling its contents across the kitchen floor. Books scattered, pens rolled under the refrigerator, and there, right in the middle of it all, was the pregnancy test I'd taken that morning. 2 pink lines staring up at everyone like an accusation. The silence was deafening. Mom's serving spoon clattered to the floor. Jake's mouth fell open. Emma just stared, not really understanding what she was seeing, but sensing the shift in the room like animals sense an earthquake coming. Then my father exploded. "What have you done?" His voice shook the windows. His face turned purple, veins bulging in his forehead. "You've destroyed this family's reputation. Everything we've worked for, everything we've built in this community, gone!" I tried to speak, tried to explain, but he wasn't listening. He never listened when he got like this. "Pack your bags," he said, his voice suddenly cold as ice. "You're not my daughter anymore. I will not have a whore living under my roof." Mom said nothing. She just stood there clutching her apron, tears streaming down her face. Jake disappeared upstairs. Emma started crying, asking what was happening, but nobody answered her. Have you ever been judged without being heard? Have you ever tried to speak your truth, only to have the people who are supposed to love you most turn their backs on you? Stay with me, because what happened next changed everything. That night, I packed my few belongings into 2 suitcases. My hands shook as I folded clothes, grabbed photos, tried to figure out what a pregnant 17-year-old girl would need to survive in the world alone. The only thing I took that mattered was my grandmother's cross necklace, a delicate gold chain she'd given me before she died, saying, "This will protect you and guide you to truth, Mija." By morning, I was gone. But here's what they never knew, what they never bothered to ask before they threw me away like garbage. I didn't get pregnant because I was promiscuous or reckless or any of the things they assumed. I got pregnant because 3 months earlier, at Sarah Chin's Sweet 16 party, David Morrison, the golden boy son of my father's business partner, had cornered me in an upstairs bedroom and taken something that wasn't his to take. I tried to tell them. God, I tried. The morning after it happened, I sat at our kitchen table, still wearing yesterday's clothes, my hair a mess, mascara smudged under my eyes. Mom was making pancakes, humming some hymn under her breath. Dad was reading his newspaper, coffee steaming beside his plate. "Mom, Dad," I started, my voice barely a whisper. "Something happened at the party last night." Dad looked up from his paper, annoyed at the interruption. "What kind of something?" I took a deep breath. "David Morrison, he hurt me." The humming stopped. Mom turned from the stove, spatula in hand. "Hurt you how?" she asked, but her tone was already skeptical, already dismissive. He forced me to—" I couldn't say the words. I was 17. I'd been raised in a conservative Christian household where we barely talked about sex, let alone assault. Dad slammed his newspaper down. "Are you seriously trying to tell me that David Morrison, whose father has been my business partner for 10 years, whose family sits 3 pews behind us every Sunday, assaulted you?" "Yes," I whispered. "That's impossible," Mom said firmly. "David is a good boy from a good family. You probably just misunderstood the situation." "I didn't misunderstand anything!" The words burst out of me, desperate and raw. "He held me down. He wouldn't listen when I said no." "Lower your voice," Dad hissed, glancing toward the stairs where Jake and Emma were getting ready for school. "And stop making these wild accusations. You probably led him on and now you're having regrets." "I didn't." "Enough." Dad stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. "I won't have you spreading lies about a respectable family. You went to that party against our better judgment. You probably drank too much, made poor choices, and now you want to blame someone else for your mistakes." Mom nodded along, her face set in disapproving lines. "Your father's right, Sophia. Good girls don't find themselves in these situations. Maybe this is a lesson about the company you keep and the choices you make." They dismissed me. They dismissed my pain, my trauma, my truth, all to protect their precious reputation and their business relationships. 3 months later, when that pregnancy test revealed the consequence of their willful blindness, they threw me away without a second thought. The first few weeks were the hardest. I slept in my car until it got repossessed. Then I found space in a women's shelter downtown, sharing a room with 3 other women, a drug addict trying to get clean, a victim of domestic violence with 2 small children, and an elderly woman who'd been evicted from her apartment. I lost my scholarship, of course. Stanford sent a polite letter explaining that they couldn't offer admission to someone who couldn't maintain the moral standards expected of their students. Just like that, my future disappeared. The church community that had once praised me as an example for other young people now whispered about me in parking lots and fellowship halls. "Such a shame," they'd say, shaking their heads. "She had such potential. Just goes to show you never really know someone." Extended family stopped calling. Aunts and uncles who'd sent birthday cards and Christmas gifts suddenly acted like I'd never existed. My cousin Maria, who'd been my best friend since childhood, crossed the street when she saw me at the grocery store. I was utterly, completely alone. Except I wasn't, really. Because growing inside me was this little person who was counting on me to figure out how to survive. At night, in that crowded shelter, I'd put my hand on my still flat stomach and whisper promises. "I'll protect you. I'll give you everything I can. I'll never let anyone make you feel unwanted." I got a job at a diner working the night shift because they didn't ask many questions and I could hide my growing belly under the loose uniform. Mrs. Patterson, the owner, was a tough old woman who'd raised 5 kids as a single mother. She took one look at me and said, "You eat free here, girl. Growing a baby takes energy." When my son Mason was born on a rainy April morning, I was completely alone in that hospital room. No family in the waiting room, no friends bringing balloons and flowers. Just me and this perfect tiny human who looked up at me with dark eyes so much like my father's that it took my breath away. The nurses were kind. Dr. Sarah Chen, the pediatrician who checked Mason over, lingered longer than necessary, asking gentle questions about my support system, my plans, my resources. When I admitted I had nowhere to go, she gave me her business card. "I run a support group for young mothers," she said quietly. "Tuesday evenings at the community center. You don't have to figure this out alone." That support group saved my life. 8 women, all facing similar challenges, some abandoned by family, others by partners, all trying to build futures for their children from nothing. We became each other's family, sharing resources, babysitting, celebrating small victories together. Mason was 6 months old when I made a decision that would change everything. I was working 3 jobs, cleaning offices at night, serving tables during lunch shifts, and doing data entry on weekends, barely scraping together enough for rent on a studio apartment in a rough neighborhood. I was exhausted, stressed, and starting to wonder if my parents had been right. Maybe I'd ruined my life. But watching Mason sleep in his second-hand crib, seeing him smile when I came home each day, I realized something. I wasn't ruined. I was being refined. Every struggle, every closed door, every person who'd turned their back on me was making me stronger, more determined, more focused on what really mattered. I sold my grandmother's cross necklace. It broke my heart, but Mason needed formula and diapers, and the pawn shop offered enough to cover both for 2 weeks. As I walked away from that shop, the necklace in someone else's hands, I made myself a promise. Someday, I'd buy it back, and when I did, it would represent not just survival, but victory. I started taking night classes at the community college, studying to become a nurse. Mason would sleep in his car seat beside me in the back of lecture halls while I took notes on anatomy and pharmacology. My professors were understanding. Several were mothers themselves and remembered the struggle. Years blended together in a haze of diaper changes, late-night study sessions, clinical rotations, and the constant juggling of work and school and motherhood. Mason took his first steps in the break room at the hospital where I was doing my residency. He said his first word, Mama, during finals week of my second year. By the time he was 5 and starting kindergarten, I'd graduated from nursing school and landed a job at Children's Memorial Hospital. By the time he was 10, I'd been promoted to charge nurse. By the time he was 13, I was head of the pediatric ICU and had started a nonprofit organization providing support and resources for teenage mothers. The whole time, Mason was my constant companion and motivation. He was brilliant, reading by age 4, doing algebra in 6th grade, composing music on the keyboard I'd bought him from a thrift store. But more than that, he was kind. He volunteered at our local food bank, helped elderly neighbors with their groceries, and never complained about our modest lifestyle or the fact that he was being raised by a single mother. Mom, he said one day when he was 14, why don't I have grandparents like other kids? I'd been dreading this question for years. How do you explain to a child that his grandparents threw his mother away? How do you tell him that the people who should love him unconditionally have never even tried to meet him? It's complicated, sweetheart, I said carefully. Sometimes families have disagreements, and sometimes those disagreements last longer than they should. But don't they want to know me? He asked, and the innocent hurt in his voice nearly broke me. I think, I said slowly, that they're missing out on knowing the most amazing person in the world, and that's their loss, not yours. But I could see the questions in his eyes, the longing for connection to something bigger than just the two of us. And I realized that maybe it was time to stop running from my past and start facing it. It took me 2 years to work up the courage, but finally, when Mason was 15, the same age I was when everything fell apart, I sat down and wrote a letter to my parents. I didn't apologize because I'd done nothing wrong. I didn't beg because I'd learned my own worth. Instead, I simply told them that they had a grandson, that he was curious about them, and that if they wanted to meet him, they could come to my house on Saturday afternoon. I gave them my address, the same address in Willow Creek Estates, the upscale neighborhood where my parents had always dreamed of living but could never afford. The house I'd bought with 15 years of hard work, sacrifice, and determination. What they didn't know was what I had built during those 15 years of silence. What they didn't know was that their abandoned daughter had become someone they'd barely recognize. What they didn't know was that the grandson they'd never met would challenge everything they thought they knew about family, about love, about the consequences of their choices. The letter was simple. If you want to meet your grandson, you know where to find us. I never expected them to actually show up, but they did show up. Not immediately. It took 3 weeks after I sent that letter for anything to happen. 3 weeks of Mason asking every day if today would be the day he'd meet his grandparents. 3 weeks of me checking the mailbox, half hoping for a response, half dreading it. The first sign that they'd received my letter came from an unexpected source. Dr. Sarah Chen called me at work on a Thursday afternoon. She'd been more than my son's pediatrician over the years. She'd become a friend, a mentor, someone who'd watched both Mason and me grow and heal. Sophia, she said, her voice careful, I need to tell you something. A man came to my office today asking questions about you and Mason, said he was Mason's grandfather. My heart stopped. What did he want to know? Medical history mostly, but also, he seemed genuinely surprised that Mason existed, like he was trying to piece together a puzzle he didn't understand. I gripped the phone tighter. What did you tell him? Nothing specific, of course. Patient confidentiality. But Sophia, she paused. I still have your file from 15 years ago, from the night you came to the emergency room after that party. The medical report I filed, the photos I took, the counseling referrals I made that you never used because you were too scared. It's all still here. My breath caught. I'd forgotten about that night, or tried to forget it. After the pregnancy test, After being thrown out, the assault had seemed like ancient history compared to survival. "I kept everything," Dr. Chen continued. "I had a feeling someday you might need it, and I think that day might be coming." She was right, because Mason had started asking harder questions, questions that deserved real answers, and because somewhere in the back of my mind I'd always known this day would come, the day when the truth would finally matter more than keeping the peace. That weekend, I drove to the courthouse downtown and requested a copy of the police report I'd filed 16 years ago. I'd been 18 by then, 3 months after the assault, scared and alone, and finally brave enough to walk into that police station and tell a stranger what David Morrison had done to me. The officer who took my statement was kind, but realistic. "Without physical evidence, without witnesses, it's going to be hard to prosecute," he'd said. "These cases rarely go anywhere, especially when it's your word against someone from a prominent family." He was right. David Morrison's father hired an expensive lawyer who painted me as a troubled teenager trying to extort money from an upstanding family. My parents refused to support me, even encouraged me to drop these false accusations before they ruin more lives. The case was quietly dismissed, filed away, and forgotten. But not lost. Never lost. I sat in my car in that courthouse parking lot, holding that police report, reading my own words from 16 years ago. The clinical language of official documents couldn't hide the raw pain in my statement. I told him to stop. I said no multiple times. He held my wrists down and told me I wanted it, that girls like me always wanted it. Mason found me crying at the kitchen table that night, the report spread out in front of me alongside medical records, newspaper clippings I'd printed from the internet about recent allegations against David Morrison. Now City Councilman Morrison, pillar of the community, married father of 3. Mom?" Mason's voice was soft, concerned. He was tall for 15, almost as tall as me now, with his grandfather's dark eyes and his great-grandmother's stubborn chin. "What's all this?" I looked at my son, this beautiful, brilliant boy who'd grown up knowing only love and support from me, who'd never questioned why we were a family of 2, who trusted me completely. And I realized it was time for him to know the truth. "Sit down, sweetheart," I said, gathering the papers into a neat stack. "There are some things about our family history that you need to know." I told him everything. Not the sanitized version I'd planned to tell him when he was older. Not the gentle half-truths I'd rehearsed. The whole truth. About the assault. About trying to tell my parents. About being dismissed and disbelieved and eventually thrown away. Mason listened without interrupting, his face growing more serious with each revelation. When I finished, he sat in silence for a long moment. "So I exist because some guy assaulted you?" he finally asked. "You exist because I chose to love you before you were even born," I corrected firmly. "How you came to be doesn't define who you are." "And my grandparents, they threw you out without even knowing the truth?" "They threw me out because they cared more about their reputation than their daughter." Mason's jaw tightened, another trait inherited from his grandfather. "That's not okay." "No," I agreed. "It wasn't. Do you think they'll actually come? To meet me?" I reached across the table and took his hand. "I don't know, but if they do, you need to understand that whatever happens, whatever they say or do, it doesn't reflect on you. You are not responsible for their choices, past or present." 3 days later, on a Saturday afternoon, they came. I was in the kitchen preparing lunch when I heard Mason call out, "Mom, there's a car in our driveway." I walked to the front window and felt my world tilt. A silver Mercedes, my father's dream car that he'd finally been able to afford. I watched as 2 familiar figures got out. My parents, older and grayer than in the mental photographs I carried, looking uncertain and out of place as they stared up at my house. My beautiful house. The 2-story colonial with the wraparound porch and the professionally landscaped yard. The house in Willow Creek Estates that I'd worked 3 jobs to afford, that represented everything I'd built from nothing. They approached the front door slowly, like they were walking toward an execution. I could see them taking in the details, the expensive cars in neighboring driveways, the manicured lawns, the clear evidence that this was not the life they'd expected their cast-off daughter to be living. The doorbell rang. Mason looked at me questioningly. I nodded, took a deep breath, and opened the door. For a moment, nobody spoke. They stared at me, really looked at me, for the first time in 15 years. I wasn't the broken, pregnant teenager they'd thrown away. I was a successful woman in designer clothes, standing in the doorway of a house that cost more than my father had earned in his best year. "Hello, Mom." "Dad," I said calmly. "Sophia." My mother's voice was barely a whisper. She looked older, frailer than I remembered. My father seemed smaller somehow, less imposing than the giant figure who'd terrorized my teenage years. "You came," I said. We got your letter," Dad said awkwardly. He was looking past me into the house, taking in the marble entryway, the crystal chandelier, the family photos lining the walls. "This is your house?" Mom asked, and I could hear the shock in her voice. "It is. Please, come in." They followed me into the living room, their eyes wide as they took in the leather furniture, the original artwork, the baby grand piano in the corner where Mason practiced every evening. Through the French doors, they could see the pool, the outdoor kitchen, the garden where I grew vegetables and herbs. "How?" Dad started, then stopped himself. "How what? How did the pregnant teenager you threw away manage to afford all this?" I kept my voice level, professional. "Hard work, education, 15 years of building something from nothing." That's when Mason appeared in the doorway. They went pale. All three of them just froze, staring at each other in shock at what they saw, because Mason looked exactly like my father had at that age. I'd seen the photos in old family albums. Same dark eyes, same strong jawline, same way of standing with one shoulder slightly raised. But there was something else in Mason's face that had never been in my father's. Kindness, warmth, the confidence that comes from being unconditionally loved. "Mason," I said softly, "these are your grandparents." Mason stepped forward, polite but reserved, and extended his hand. "It's nice to meet you," he said formally. My father stared at that outstretched hand for a long moment before slowly reaching out to shake it. When their hands touched, I saw something crack in his face. "You look," he started, his voice rough. "You look like me, like I did when I was your age." "That's what Mom says," Mason replied evenly. We sat in my living room, the living room I'd designed and decorated, filled with photos of Mason's achievements, his art projects, his school awards, and they tried to make conversation. But how do you talk to the grandson you've never met, the daughter you abandoned, in the house that proves how wrong you were about everything? "You're a doctor?" Mom asked, noticing my medical degree on the wall. "Nurse," I corrected. "But I run the pediatric ICU at Children's Memorial, and I have my own nonprofit organization that helps teenage mothers." The irony wasn't lost on any of us. "Sophia," Dad said slowly, we want you to know that we've missed you. These 15 years, they've been hard," Mom finished. "We've regretted, we've wondered." "Have you?" I asked quietly. "Because you had my address. I've lived in this same city for 15 years. You could have reached out any time." They had no answer for that. Mason, bless him, tried to fill the uncomfortable silence. "Would you like to see my room? I have some music I've been working on." As we walked upstairs, I watched my parents take in more evidence of the life they'd missed. Mason's bedroom walls covered with academic achievement certificates, science fair ribbons, photographs from his volunteer work at the Children's Hospital. The bookshelf filled with advanced mathematics and science texts, philosophy books, novels in both English and Spanish. "You play piano?" Mom asked, noticing the keyboard in the corner of his room. "And guitar." "And I'm learning violin," Mason said. "Mom saved up to get me lessons when I was 8. "What do you want to study in college?" Dad asked. "Pre-med. I want to be a pediatric surgeon like Dr. Rodriguez at Mom's hospital." Mason's face lit up when he talked about his dreams. "Mom says I can change the world one child at a time." I watched my parents' faces as they realized what they'd missed, what they'd thrown away. Not just me, their daughter who'd become successful despite their abandonment, but this incredible young man who carried their genes but had been shaped entirely by my love. When we came back downstairs, I made them coffee and we sat around my dining room table, the same table where Mason did his homework every night, where we'd shared 15 years of meals and conversations and dreams. "Sophia," Dad said finally, "we owe you an apology. We made mistakes." "Did you?" I asked calmly. "What kind of mistakes?" Mom shifted uncomfortably. "We were young parents. We were scared about what people would think. We reacted badly to your situation." "My situation," I repeated. "Is that what you're calling it?" "Your pregnancy," Dad clarified, like saying the word was painful. I reached into the folder I'd placed on the sideboard and pulled out the police report, the medical records, the newspaper clippings about David Morrison's recent indictment on sexual assault charges involving 3 other women. "Before you apologize for reacting badly to my pregnancy," I said, placing the documents in front of them, "maybe you should know the truth about how that pregnancy happened." They read in silence. I watched the color drain from their faces as they took in the details. The assault, my attempt to tell them, their dismissal of my accusations, the years of pain that followed. When Dad finished reading, he couldn't speak for 10 full minutes. He just sat there, staring at his hands, his face white as paper. Mom was crying silently, her hands shaking as she held the medical report Dr. Chen had written the night I'd finally gotten up the courage to seek help. "You tried to tell us," she whispered. "I did." "And we didn't believe you." "You didn't." "We said it was your fault." "You did." The silence stretched between us, heavy with 15 years of pain and missed opportunities. Finally, Dad looked up at me, tears in his eyes. "Sophia, how can we ever—" "You can't," I said simply. "You can't undo 15 years. You can't give me back the family support I needed when I was scared and pregnant and alone. You can't give Mason back his childhood with grandparents who loved him. You can't change the fact that you chose your reputation over your daughter's well-being." "But we want to try," Mom said desperately. "We want to be in Mason's life. We want to know our grandson." I looked at Mason, who'd been quietly listening to this whole conversation. He met my eyes, and I saw my own strength reflected back at me. "That's not up to me," I said. "That's up to Mason. But if you want to be in his life, you need to understand something. I'm not the same broken girl you threw away. I'm not going to pretend that what you did was okay or minimize the damage it caused just to make you feel better." "We understand," Dad said quickly. "Do you? Because there's more." I pulled out my phone and showed them a photo from last week's newspaper, me receiving the Nurse of the Year award from the State Medical Association. "I'm being honored at a banquet next Friday night, the same week as your church's annual fundraising gala, I believe." They recognized the implications immediately. "If you want to be part of our lives," I continued, "really be part of them, then you need to be proud of what I've accomplished. You need to be willing to tell people who ask that your daughter is a successful medical professional and your grandson is an honor student who's never caused a day of trouble in his life." "Of course we're proud," Mom started. "Are you? Because when people at church ask where I've been for 15 years, what are you going to tell them? Are you going to explain that you threw out your pregnant daughter without knowing she'd been assaulted? Are you going to admit that you were wrong?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Mason stood up suddenly. "I need to think about all this," he said quietly. "I'm going for a walk." After he left, my parents and I sat in silence for a long time. "He's angry," Mom finally said. "He's disappointed," I corrected. "He's 15 years old and he just learned that the grandparents he's been curious about his whole life threw his mother away when she needed them most. He's processing the fact that you could have been part of his life all along, but chose not to be." "We didn't know about him," Dad said weakly. "You didn't want to know. There's a difference." When Mason came back an hour later, he sat down across from his grandparents and looked them in the eye. "I want to know you," he said carefully, "but I need you to understand something. My mom is the strongest, most incredible person I know. She raised me by herself, worked multiple jobs to give me opportunities, never once made me feel like I was a burden or a mistake. If you want to be my grandparents, you have to respect her. You have to acknowledge what she's accomplished. And you have to accept that she didn't need you to become amazing. She did it despite you. I had never been more proud of him. My parents left that day with a promise to call, to stay in touch, to try to build something from the ruins of what they'd destroyed. But as I watched their Mercedes pull out of my driveway, I realized something important. I didn't need their validation anymore. I didn't need their apology or their acceptance or their presence in our lives. For 15 years, I'd built something beautiful from nothing. I'd raised an incredible son, built a successful career, created a home filled with love and laughter and hope. I'd broken the cycle of judgment and abandonment that had defined my childhood. I'd proven that sometimes the family that rejects you gives you the strength to build something better. The cross necklace sat in my jewelry box upstairs. I'd bought it back 2 years ago, just like I'd promised myself I would. But it no longer represented survival. Now it represented triumph. Not just mine, but Mason's too. And maybe, if they were willing to do the work, it could represent redemption for my parents as well. But that was their choice to make. I'd already made mine.